Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you're tuning in. This is your professor, Dr. McAllister, and welcome to week 2 of Ecology. This week, I'm super excited because we're going to be discussing biogeography and adaptations to aquatic and terrestrial biomes. Remember from last week, we learned that the biosphere encompasses all parts of Earth inhabited by all living organisms. This includes aquatic environments, which make up most of the Earth's surface, and we know water made life possible. Scientists have agreed that life most likely began in the ocean, and we'll explore a few case studies about oceanic life. So there's the aquatic. The biosphere also includes the terrestrial landscape, where all land-dwelling organisms occur. And then lastly, it includes the atmosphere. And this is where we'll find microparticles and very small organisms, including microorganisms that disperse throughout the air. And your allergies are probably not bothering you right now, but come springtime, you can thank the evolution of pollination for those allergies. So biogeography is the study of the geographic distribution of living things and the abiotic factors that affect that distribution. So if we look at this map, here we go, we can see that the former distribution, so it's this light pink color here, was of the jaguar, was much, much greater than its current distribution. And when we start to see these differences, we start to think, okay, what are the abiotic factors that would be governing this? And one of the big ones are going to be temperature, okay, and rainfall or precipitation. And that's going to set some very, very distinct biomes. And we're going to see that these change across both latitude and elevation as well. Okay, so as you move away from the poles or you move up into the atmosphere with elevation. So here we're looking at a global pattern of precipitation. And so this is a map from NASA, which you can see there. And the redder colors, the yellower colors are the areas of higher precipitation, okay? And so what you should notice is that we see these distinct bands right sort of through the equator and the tropics there. And then as we move on either side of those, as we move either to higher latitudes or to lower latitudes, you can see that it becomes much, much bluer. And bluer is indication of lower precipitation, okay, outside of the tropics. Similar for temperature, we know it's hotter in the tropics than it is at the poles. And in about 2 weeks, we're going to learn why temperature and precipitation follow these types of very, very predictable patterns. And it has to do with the Earth's rotation and prevailing wind patterns that set up this sort of a global climatic pattern that we can observe. So these differences in temperature and precipitation at global scales drive patterns in species distribution and species diversity. So one major pattern is that the latitudinal gradient in species diversity. And if we look here, if we look at the red, this is where the red and the yellow, this is where we have high species diversity. So we know that species diversity is greatest in tropical ecosystems, and it decreases as you move towards the poles. Okay? So for example, in one tropical forest in Costa Rica, there are more species or more tree species than there are in all of the United States. And this is because temperature, precipitation, and seasonality create constraints as to what can live there. And those constraints might be physiological, for example. So freezing temperatures can kill many organisms because blood is mostly water, water freezes, and when water freezes, things burst, and that's not good for organisms. So in our case studies this week, we'll learn about organisms that have adapted to some of these constraints, right? They've evolved strategies in response to these constraints so they can live in some of these unique environments. These changes in global climate across latitude alter the composition of plant and animal communities. So here we're looking at a biome of the biomes of Africa, and this green through here are the tropical rainforests that are kind of centered on the equator. And if we start walking north from there, we'd first cross through savanna, then desert, then into the chaparral area, and then into temperate deciduous and coniferous forest, and eventually we'd end up in the tundra, the Arctic with the tundra. And the species composition of each place is going to change, and their adaptations reflect traits adapted to those unique environments, right? So polar bears don't occur in the tropics, and many other species aren't adapted to live in the Arctic. Right? Of course, when we look at this at a global biome map like this, the boundaries here are drawn very distinctly and appear rigid, but we know that it's much more of a gradual shift than this, okay? So very, very sort of fuzzy boundaries along here. And different ecosystems can exist at the same latitude due to other abiotic factors, and these could include, changes in jet stream conditions that bring in warmer air, or changes in ocean currents, or differences in topography and elevation as well. So one of the earliest biogeographers in modern science was Alexander von Humboldt. And we'll get into his elevation gradients in a moment, but he was also very famous for, his name is also on it, the Humboldt Current, which is off of Peru, and it is this cold, unique current that's seen there. And when El Nino times come, this is when we see this current change because of these oscillations that we have in pressure gradients. But back to sort of our elevational gradients here. And what he noticed was he did a lot of traveling. And in that travels, he recognized several important things. And that was when he was hiking up some of these different mountains, the changes in vegetation paralleled those that you would see across changes in elevation. Okay, so sorry, against latitude. Right? So he would see these changes in communities. You can see these different communities are labeled here. As he hiked up the mountain, were very, very similar to the changes that he would see when he crossed different latitudes, like we were just looking at from the biome map from Africa as we went northwards towards the Arctic. And he found that tropical forests typically occur at the lowest areas, and then this would be followed by deciduous forest to alpine or coniferous and then tundra. And all of this might take us a few hours to drive, but we would see these very, very similar changes in composition of plant and animal communities that would mirror those that we would see as we cross different latitudes, okay? And so in all these different ways, changes in temperature and precipitation across elevation drive these differences in species composition across the mountains as well. So ecologists who study biogeography examine patterns of species distribution. And there are important terms we use to distinguish species based on their distribution patterns. So an endemic species is one that is naturally only found in a very specific geographic area. And oftentimes that area tends to be restricted in size, but not always. So again, it's the only place on the planet you can find this species is in one particular area. And in this case, we're looking at this cute little pebble toad, which is only found on tabletop mountains in Venezuela and Guyana in South America. Okay, so it's quite unique, and it's only found at that very distinct location, and they're called endemic. Okay. Other species their distribution tends to be more cosmopolitan, all right? So it's found a lot more areas. So these would be more generalist, okay? So these species live in a wide range of geographic areas, like this cute little baby raccoon that I picked for the slide. But again, so raccoons are native to most of North and Central America, and so they cover a very, very large geographic range. So again, they're known as cosmopolitan or generalist, where you can find them in much more than one specific location. So species distribution patterns are based on biotic and abiotic factors, okay? And the influence of those factors over very long periods of time, because that's what's required for the evolution of species, so geological periods of time. So because of this, the very early studies of biogeography were very much linked to the emergence of evolutionary thinking, right, in the 18th century. So Darwin, for example, Alexander von Humboldt, Alfred Russel Wallace, all right, they were really, really good biogeographers, which inspired their ideas on evolution. So Alfred Russel Wallace's work, all right, provided evidence for an event called the Great American Biotic Exchange. So around 3 to 4 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama emerged from the ocean floor and provided a land bridge between North and South America. Okay? So this allowed land-dwelling animals to migrate between the two continents for the first time in Earth's history. Okay? So this event led to this mass migration of species from North America to South America, like bears and llamas, and from South America to North America, like possums and armadillos. Right? And some of these species are extinct today, right? Like the mastodon, we don't have any more mastodons today, but some of them and many of them still occur, okay? So, of course, this formation of this land bridge also changed oceanic circulation patterns as well and isolated populations of some ocean-dwelling species, which then evolved into distinct species on either side, so the Atlantic or the Pacific side of Central America. And so it's a really, really fascinating event, and we can see it in fossil records and we can see it in the genetics of species still occurring today. So changes in abiotic factors impact species distributions on large continental scales, like we saw in the Great American Biotic Exchange example. But abiotic factors also influence species distributions in other ways at smaller scales. So, for example, we know that light availability is important for adaptations in plants and determines where some species are found. So, for example, you'll find some that are located in the canopy or the dark understory, and they've adapted their photosynthetic machinery to be able to deal with these low light conditions. Okay. Whereas other plants are going to emerge on the forest floor before canopy trees start leafing out in the spring. And so it really depends on their adaptation, their ability to adapt to different light levels. Okay. In aquatic systems, we know light does not reach beyond a certain zone, usually called the photic zone, where you have photosynthesis occurring. So aquatic plants are restricted to the upper zones or upper levels where light is available. Right? We also know that there are temperature gradients or thermoclines, so a change in temperature with depth in aquatic environments, particularly in large bodies of water like lakes, Lake Superior, oceans, for example, and many organisms are quite sensitive to changes in temperature, and that dictates where they're able to live and function. This is because few organisms, number one, can survive at temperatures below freezing, and this is due to metabolic constraints like they were just talking about, where organisms are made of water, and we know water freezes. When water freezes, it expands and it can burst cells and tissues, so it's a problem. But it's also rare for living organisms to survive really, really high temperatures. So temperatures above 113 degrees Fahrenheit or 45 degrees Celsius. Again, if you remember back from Bio 151, enzymes get denatured at these high temperatures. So unless you're an organism that has an adaptive trait that confers survival and increased fitness in these types of extreme environments, such as these hot springs, which could be from Yellowstone, for example, you're not going to be able to live there. But some organisms, these extremophiles, have been able to adapt to these temperatures, and they can maintain their metabolism, and their cellular machinery can work because they have specific adaptations to deal with these much, much higher temperatures. To understand how organisms and their metabolism are impacted by temperatures, ecologists often use a metric called the Q10 value, okay, which is that some physiological rate, okay, we could say oxygen consumption, okay, measured at temperature T, okay, a given temperature, divided by the same physiological rate at temperature T minus 10 degrees Celsius. Okay, so what does that mean? So it means, for example, you could go and you could measure oxygen consumption rate of a fish at 20 degrees, and then measure oxygen consumption rate at 20 minus 10 or 10 degrees. And you can do this across lots of different individuals, lots of different species, lots of different habitats, etc. And it'll give you an idea of how thermally stressed an organism is at these different temperatures and with these different temperature changes. And this is something that's really important when we start thinking about climate change and how that might be impacting and stressing different types of organisms. There are several ways organisms can adapt to fluctuating or extreme temperatures. So hibernation, for example, is a way many land mammals avoid extreme winter temperatures, which is also found in some reptiles. So reptiles will brumate, okay, again, to avoid these cold temperatures. Some organisms in really hot, dry environments, such as in the desert, will estivate, in which their metabolism is significantly reduced. In many organisms, this is a seasonal occurrence, okay, but in others, it can be daily. And so it's, for example, in hummingbirds. So tropical hummingbirds at high elevations in the Peruvian Andes, where it gets very, very cold at night, will enter into a state known as torpor, which reduces their metabolism at night when nighttime temperatures are low. And this is good because they don't have to expend the energy to stay warm. In these lower conditions, they require less energy. So one outcome of climate change is that nighttime temperatures are warming faster, right? Faster than daytime temperatures. And because of this, hummingbirds don't reach torpor, and so their metabolism is remaining elevated. So it's not cold enough, so they're not going into torpor, and so their metabolism is remaining elevated, which means that they require additional food resources during the day. Okay? Other organisms migrate to avoid unfavorable temperatures. So, the birds migrating south for the winter, I certainly wish that I could do that at times. So again, just leaving and moving temporarily via migration to a place where temperatures are more adaptable for yourself. Water, okay? Water is an abiotic factor that is extremely important, and it's required by all living things, okay? It's critical for cellular processes. So all terrestrial organisms lose water to the external environment through simple diffusion. And because of this, land plants and animals evolved a number of adaptations to retain water. Okay? Okay. Plants have a number of features, including waxy leaf cuticles, which will repel water, and trichomes, or little leaf hairs, that decrease the rate of water loss. And of course, plants also have stomata, which you should remember from intro bio. These are the openings on the underside of the leaves that open and close in response to things like temperature and, of course, the water status of the organism, the plant. Freshwater organisms like fish are immersed in water and are constantly in danger of having water diffuse into their cells and sort of blow them up due to osmosis. And this is what we call hyperosmotic, because the concentrations of solutes like ions, so sodium and potassium, that are needed for transport channels, are in higher concentration internally inside the fish. And so water wants to come in to be able to dilute that. So the fish have many adaptations that have evolved to maintain the proper solute concentrations in their bodies. Okay? And one of these adaptations is the excretion of very, very dilute urine, so they pee a lot. Okay? They get rid of a lot of water there. Freshwater fish drink very little water. Okay? And so again, they're not consuming it, and they're excreting it in their urine. Okay? In contrast, if we think about marine organisms, they're termed what is hypoosmotic. Okay? So they are constantly in danger of having water diffuse out of their cells because they are surrounded by water with a higher solute concentration than what's in the organism. Okay, so there's more salt outside in marine water, ocean water, than there is in the organism. And this is what we call hypoosmotic organism, because the solute concentration is in lower concentration internally inside the fish. So the fish are quite literally constantly at risk of drying up because they lose so much of their water to the environment. And so these organisms have morphological and physiological adaptations to retain water and release solutes. So you'll find that a lot of these fish have the ability to excrete salts in their gills, and they will not, their urine is very, very concentrated, so very little water that's in it. You'll also see in, for example, sea turtles and other organisms, they have salt glands in their eyes where they will get rid of salts and secrete some of these salts. So this week we will continue learning about adaptations through 2 case studies. We'll learn about an example of what happens in an environment that is too cold and explore how gene duplications and mutations led to physiological adaptations in Antarctic ice fish, which avoid freezing in the icy ocean. And then we'll go to another extreme and explore how organisms respond when the environment becomes too hot. So we'll look at and explore coral bleaching, see why it happens. Your discussion for this week will continue on looking at corals and their threats and why they are important. And so I look forward to reading all of your contributions, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.